Okay, welcome. This is Josh Sussman from Nefesh B'Nefesh Marketing and Programming Team. We are happy that you're able to join us tonight. This is the first time we have ever tackled this topic. I'm excited to see that we had almost 300 people register. It's a topic that is obviously important, somewhat daunting, and we're happy to have with us Aaron Janagli, who will be giving the presentation this evening, and Mike Ellis, who will be helping with the questions in the Q&A, both from Pioneer Wealth Management. Please direct your questions throughout the presentation to the Q&A, not in the chat. The chat will not be monitored for questions. The Q&A is a much more efficient way to follow questions and have them answered. The presentation itself should be about 20-25 minutes, which should leave us plenty of time to take your questions, and Aaron will answer them as we go. Thank you very much, and I will leave it to Aaron.
Thank you very much, Josh. Appreciate Nefesh B'Nefesh hosting us again, as they have done on a number of webinars. Thrilled to be able to present for the first ever time something more relevant to Olim and current residents in Israel, as opposed to future residents of Israel, although I am going to cover, and you'll see on my table of contents shortly, because there's just a wide range of people who have joined this webinar. There should be something for everybody in their circumstances, whether you're already living in Israel, whether you're still within your first 10 years of living in Israel, or whether you're outside. And we will also cover off the US citizen angle, because your circumstances are different, whether you live in the US or you're currently resident in Israel. I'm thrilled that my colleague Mike Ellis is also joining me. You won't see him, but he will be on the question and answers. So if there are things that you want to ask during the middle of the presentation, please do use the question and answer facility, and Mike will get on it. Mike has seen the presentation, so he'll also be able to let you know if it's something that I'm going to cover in a future part of the presentation. Without further ado, we're going to get started. So do appreciate you joining us on this Tuesday evening. As Josh said, should take around 20 to 25 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for any questions that you have. And my contact details will be available on the last slide. So if you do have any kind of more personal questions and you want to just drop me a quick email, feel absolutely free to do so. My phone number's there for phone calls or WhatsApp too. Okay, so a little bit about me. Originally English, made Aliyah from London just over 7 years ago, live in Ra'anana, basically from day one, with my wife and 4 children. I've been basically assisting Olim with their finances pretty much since I arrived. I've been 12 years in the industry, originally with HSBC Private Bank in London, and then my first role in Israel, I transferred across to the Tel Aviv office, was head of English-speaking clients at Edmund de Rothschild for 2 years, and then 3.5 years ago made the transition to Pioneer Wealth Management, which I will describe a little bit on the next slide. Personally, I'm a fully licensed portfolio manager in Israel, which is basically the highest possible qualification one can get in my field, and it does mean that I personally am regulated by the Israeli Securities Authority. And that's, I think, something that is important, and I will explain further on into the presentation just how important the notion of regulation is within Israel. We try and provide an Anglo client service level. For those of you who have a UK point of reference, I like to think of it as John Lewis customer service. I appreciate that may be lost on some people, but even here in Israel, where customer service is probably one of the challenges on a day-to-day basis, we do try and look after to clients in the kind of way in which they're used to being looked after. I have a global client base. I've got clients obviously resident in Israel who prefer to be serviced in English. I have clients in America, in Canada, in the UK, in South Africa, and even in Australia. So it really is a diverse client base. A little bit about Pioneer. It's been around since 1986. We manage around $2 billion worth of assets, which in kind of American terms isn't so big, but in Israeli terms probably puts us towards the top of the second tier after the big insurance companies. We have employees from all over the world, so we also have French-speaking and Spanish-speaking portfolio managers who cater to those countries and those languages. We also fully believe in the importance of regulation. So anywhere we have clients, basically, we make sure we're properly licensed. So it gives clients a real sense of comfort that we're licensed in our home country, Israel, of course, but we're also licensed basically anywhere in the world where we are looking after clients. Our main office is in Herzliya Pituach. We've got about 55 employees there. We've also got a satellite office in Miami with another 6 or 7 employees. So we do have that kind of international feel, and we've always looked after kind of Olim and English speakers, and in general has always been our main focus. We're fully independent, so it's, you know, when I've come from that private banking world, as I described, HSBC, Edmund de Rothschild, where it's a bit of a product push and you're always selling the bank's own instruments. We don't do any of that. We haven't got any of our own instruments, any of our own products, any of our own funds. So we get to kind of walk hand in hand with the client towards their goals, their objectives, and the best practice in terms of and the best investments that work for them. We do global portfolios in all major currencies, but obviously for this webinar, we're going to be focusing really on our Shekel portfolio capabilities. But either way, whichever currency you choose to invest with us, we will individually tailor it to your tax status. So whether that's you're a foreign resident, whether you're an Ole in their first 10 years, non-American, or left in their first 10 years American, or just US resident, then we will always make sure that we invest for you as tax efficiently as possible. What are we going to cover today? 6 main things, really kind of the very basics of Shekel investing. Who can invest in Shekels and how you do so? Why? What's the investment rationale for investing in Shekels? Why do Olim in general not invest in Shekels? We're going to take a quick look at the Shekel investment opportunities as they exist today. And then obviously a crucial part of that investment in Shekel story is the tax consequences. And here I've obviously split it between US citizens and non-US citizens, just because the way they are taxed is so different. So who can invest in Shekels and how do you do so? The first answer to that really is everybody can invest in Shekels. Unless you're talking very high net worth, probably $1 million worth of Shekels or more, where you can do it in Switzerland, but it's messy and the kind of availability and options aren't really there. You need to really be holding an Israeli bank account to do it. That's by far and away the simplest and easiest way to invest in Shekels. So if you're an Israeli resident, any Israeli bank, really, you can open a bank. You can, I mean, even in Corona times, you can walk into any bank, open an account. Everybody resident in Israel, I'm sure, already has one, unless you're fresh off the plane and in your quarantine period. But that's basically, you know, the opportunity to hold investments either via a portfolio manager like us or via a investment advisor at the bank. The options for you are numerous and vast. If you're a foreign resident, and I exclude the US in this, if you already have an existing bank account, you can hold Shekel investments at Leumi, at Discount or Mizrahi. Potentially some of the smaller banks, Bain Leumi I know can do, and they're good. Definitely not Bank Hapoalim. Bank Hapoalim recently basically wrote to all their non-Israeli resident clients holding investments in any currency and basically said they cannot do them. For some clients in various jurisdictions, you may be required to utilize a duly licensed portfolio manager, both in Israel and in your country of residence. That's something we're seeing more and more. So yeah, certainly if you're South African or Canadian or American, that's certainly relevant for you right now. If you're from the UK or the rest of the EU, and that's something that we believe is coming and has already occurred for some institutions. If you do not have an account currently, but you're interested in setting one up so that you can invest in Shekels, you can do so in the excess of $500,000 accounts. You can set up via a power of attorney an account. This is talking about doing so right now. In general, the theoretical principle is that in order to open a bank account in Israel, you have to be physically present here. Now, obviously, in these COVID-19 times, travel to Israel is obviously prohibited at the moment for all tourists. It's anyway something that a lot of people, even if you have an Israeli passport, aren't particularly interested in doing. But you can actually do it remotely in excess of $500,000 for Bank Leumi, basically anywhere in the world. And if you have more than $100,000 to invest, you can do it with Bank Mizrahi, but only if you're located in the UK, because they use their local Bank Mizrahi UK to be able to help with the signatures, etc., that they require. If you're a US resident living in the US, but you want to have some diversification and invest in shekels, it's at the moment, basically, you can only be in Bank Leumi and hold investments. If you're a US resident, all the other banks will allow you to hold cash and the shekel deposits only, but no shekel investments. Again, the same, if you're a new account, you need a minimum of $500,000. And if you're a US resident, either way, you do need to use a duly licensed US and Israeli portfolio manager. Okay, so that's the who. Okay, so now we come really, which is the emphasis of this presentation, is on the why. So the first really is, and to me, it's something I think we're going to see over the next few years really, is a trend of a weakening dollar. Obviously, everything that's happened this year with the coronavirus has meant central banks, and in particular the US, have poured in money into the system. And one of the easiest ways basically for them to kind of repay that money quicker and easier is to ensure that their currency weakens. And we're seeing that with the US dollar already. And more importantly, really, is other countries, and certainly Israel is an example of that. When the US government wants to weaken its currency, the Central Bank of Israel doesn't have the ammunition or the firepower to compete. So that we do see all the time, and for those of you who read the Israeli financial press, Globes or Calculist and things of that sort, you'll always see the Bank of Israel's dipping into the market to try and stem the tide and make sure the shekel doesn't get too strong. But in reality, I'm firmly of the belief, and I think most investment professionals would probably concur, that this is something that we're going to see more and more of over the next few years, and that the shekel that today is sitting around 3.37 is much more likely to trend towards 3 than it is back towards 4. When I first started my career, I would say I used to see a lot of like multi-currency portfolios. That was very fashionable in the 90s and the early 2000s, where your main portfolio currency would be the dollar, but you'd have some exposure to Swiss francs or to pounds or to Aussie or Canadian dollars or euros, whatever it may be. I think kind of from the financial crisis in 2008 onwards, the trend has really been back to kind of dollar-focused portfolios. So the dollar was sometimes even 100% of the portfolio, and currencies weren't really used as a way of diversifying your exposure. Interestingly, I think for me really right now is the availability of other currencies really to hedge a weakening dollar doesn't really exist in the way it did then. I mean, looking at obviously personally sterling and pounds are going to still continue to be weaker with the kind of uncertainty surrounding Brexit. The euro as a concept is still struggling. You do have some maybe people who would advocate for a Swiss franc or for a yen or whatever, but even the other currencies, Canadian, Aussie dollars, etc., which are heavily linked to commodities, and we'll see a graph shortly, they're not really necessarily going to help you. The shekel has been incredibly strong over the last decade, and you'll see that shortly. And we believe it's like a trend that's going to continue. So certainly if you are somebody who has the vast majority of their assets in another country but is living in shekels, then shekel exposure is certainly something you want to consider. The other reason, and I'm thrilled we're actually doing this webinar at this kind of time, is really the market opportunities, and in particular in the bond market. If we were talking pre-corona, well-rated investment-grade bonds in the US were probably paying 3 to 3.5% a year, and the equivalently well-rated bonds in Israel were probably paying 1 or 1.5% a year in shekels. So there wasn't really an investment story to be told. You know, you're better off with a bigger company paying 3 to 3.5% in dollars than you are, you know, a smaller company, even however well-rated it is, paying 1 to 1.5. Since Corona, and really probably since around April or May, and even really in March, that's really switched around quite dramatically. I think the Israeli market was maybe felt, at least initially, a little bit let down by the Israeli central bank, that they didn't intervene into the market in quite the same way as the American and other global central banks intervened in their bond markets, and the Israeli market got a little bit spooked. And now we've basically seen the exact reverse. Good quality investment grade bonds in dollars in the States are paying probably around 1.25%. And the opportunity in the shekel bonds is probably now around 2.5 to 3% in shekels. So you've basically flipped it around, and you're basically making, you know, somewhere between double and triple percentage-wise in shekels than you are in dollars. So there's actually like an investment story to be told there, and that's really probably the first time we've seen that switch since 2011. So it's really been kind of a dollar, the dollar's been the sensible place to be for most of the last decade in terms of just bond market opportunities. But that's really switched around, and we're a big believer now in the shekel bond story. Something else that I think is really a big factor in why I push clients towards shekel portfolios. 5 years ago, if we'd have been talking about investing in shekels, your only option would have been investing in Israeli company bonds or Israeli shares on the Israeli stock exchange, and you wouldn't really have had any opportunity to access any kind of global market opportunities denominated in shekels. That world has grown exponentially. In the last 5 years, you can basically, a whole new kind of product suite has developed, denominated in shekels, and you can hold all sorts of international equities and ETFs and bond funds, equity funds, etc., denominated in shekels. So you can have an S&P 500 or a NASDAQ or a FTSE 100 or a Eurostock 600 ETF denominated in shekels. You can hedge the currency or not hedge the currency depending on your perspective of where you believe rates are going. But you could basically have an American equity portfolio, but denominated in shekels, and that's something we're doing for a lot of our clients now. Because, and I'll explain a little bit later on why we're not such a big fan of the pure Israeli equity market, but we're a very big fan of investing in foreign markets in the US or in China or in emerging markets or in Europe in shekels, and that's something that 5 years ago was not even thought about, and now the world has exploded in a very positive way, and the options for clients in shekels are way more numerous than they've ever been, and we're seeing more and more big fund managers. GAM, which is one of the big institutional managers, they've got nearly all of their products now with the shekel listing, and other big institutions are following. So that's certainly something that needs to be taken into account. I will just add, those types of funds in general are PFICs, which mean for US citizens, they're a lot messier and probably not advisable. But if you're not a US citizen, there's certainly something to be said for making sure they're part of your portfolio. The most important reason, though, I think, is really if you're living, for those of you living in Israel, you're spending every day in shekels. So yes, you may have come from abroad, you may have retired in Israel, but actually on a day-to-day basis, that exchange rate plays a huge role in your life, especially for those of you earning pension income or social security or state pensions in whichever country that you're coming from. You're really kind of always relying on that exchange rate to live. Whereas actually, if you have at least some of your assets denominated in shekels, then you're always at least going to be spending the same currency that you're bringing income in, and that's something that's basically very important. When we're investment managers, which basically means we're managing risk for clients, and there's different risks, and in order to get reward, you have to take different risks. But where there's a possibility to eliminate risks, that's certainly something that should be considered. And exchange rate risk and fluctuation in exchange rates is very much a big risk for clients who have assets in one currency, but are spending in another, in this case in shekels. And this is basically exactly, for those of you who've seen my American Nefesh B'Nefesh webinars, this will be a very familiar slide to you, because for those of you coming to Israel, you're going to have all your assets, basically all your pension schemes, the sale of your home or other investment properties that you have denominated in your home country's currency, but your day-to-day, your Aroma coffee, your Supersol shop, your Maccabi health insurance, or your IKEA home furniture is all going to be denominated in shekels. So it's balancing that exchange rate risk amongst other factors, one of which is obviously taxes, which is something that we're going to come to right now. So the real question then, basically, if I've given the push why you should invest in shekels, the question is, why don't people invest in shekels? And the truth is, in my opinion, there's two main reasons for that. The second one, the 10-year tax exemption, I'm going to come to, but the first one really behavioral finance, we're scared of what we don't know. And that's really because the shekel market is not something really that any of us have ever had exposure to before. And it is, in some ways, very similar to the markets that we're used to, but there are certain different elements of the shekel market that we're not used to. Some of the way some bonds are priced, some of the way bonds are repaid. There's various aspects of investing in shekels that is unfamiliar. And in general, as people, we don't like to get involved in something that we don't recognize and we don't know about. Now, that's obviously what we as professionals are here to kind of hold your hand and assist you with. But it is also, to me, very important to go over what I mentioned right at the beginning, and that's the issue of regulation. Unfortunately, here in Israel, I think we're somewhat behind, certainly the US and the UK and other jurisdictions too, in terms of advisors needing to be fully regulated and compliant with a regulatory body. In Israel, we still have a huge number of unregulated investment advisors. They make you sign on some forms which basically waive your right as a client to kind of any sort of due process in the case of negligence or anything else. And unfortunately, that probably has kind of scarred a lot of people too, that once you've dealt with an unregulated financial advisor and something's gone wrong, it's not usually a very pleasant process. So I do think it's super important, whoever you invest with, whether it's us or anybody else, that you basically check and ensure that they're properly regulated by the Israeli Securities Authority. And therefore, God forbid, should something go wrong, you have a regulatory body who can help you and who can get involved in, and obviously the individual financial advisor plus the company that they represent are both regulated by the Israeli Securities Authority, or whichever jurisdiction you're in. So I do think that's certainly something that needs to be said and needs to be considered for people who do wish to dip their toe into the shekel market. In terms of the 10-year tax exemption, and I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, more or less as to what it is. When you do make aliyah, you have 10 years of tax-free income from any passive income sources outside of Israel. So if you've got any property or investments that aren't shekel denominated and they're based outside Israel, you basically have 10 years where you won't pay tax on them. Particularly brilliant for basically everybody who isn't a US citizen, because you really end up paying tax nowhere for 10 years. It's like a kosher Switzerland of yesteryear, and it's a phenomenally incredible basically tax benefit. There isn't anywhere else in the world really where you can kind of do that. For high net worth and ultra high net worth people, it's also an ability to put things back into their own names rather than have trusts and other legal structures involved where there's always a cost and an ongoing administrative burden. You really can simplify your affairs and enjoy 10 years of tax-free cash, US, or tax-free income rather. US citizens, it doesn't apply. You obviously have a ongoing tax focus and requirement to pay your US taxes on your global income. So whilst you won't pay any Israeli tax on that non-Israeli income, you will still obviously be paying US tax. So for you, really, it's less of an issue, because although Israeli tax rates in general are slightly higher than US tax rates, you aren't in a position really where the tax-free exemption is such a big push towards not investing in shekels. Now, one of the first things I was taught when doing presentations is don't put too much information on one slide. Unfortunately, with this graph, I couldn't resist. This basically, and you have to bear with me a little bit as I explain what it is. On the far left of the graph, we've plotted the shekel against all these major currencies. So the red is the Swiss franc, the yellow is the dollar, the dark blue is the euro, the green is pounds, the purple mauve one is Canadian dollars, the light blue one is Australian dollars, and the orange one is South African rands. And what we've basically shown is over the last 10 years, this is how the shekel as a currency has strengthened against all these major currencies. So The best performing is the Swiss franc, which is only about 12% down against the shekel. If we go all the way down to the rand, it's around 51% down against the shekel. So if we think about it, that 10-year tax exemption, and I've put that as the headline of the slide, the erosion of wealth. I mean, if you're somebody from the UK who made Aliyah 10 years ago, and you're now looking at this graph, you can see you've lost 29% of the value of your money in pounds just because of currency fluctuations. I'm sure 100 people out of 100 would rather be paying a little bit of tax, but having a certainty of an exchange rate. And obviously this has hurt anybody who comes as a retiree from any one of these countries. If you're expecting to earn X and all of a sudden you're earning 30% less than X in the UK example, and 34% less than X in the Canadian dollar example, and even in the US dollar example, 13.5% less, it does have significant impacts on what you can afford and what you can buy. And in some cases, basically, by the time you take into account the tax you would have paid on your shekels, you'll actually ended up in a better position, in terms of your overall net wealth, if you had actually invested in shekels and paid the tax along the way. And we will discuss that shortly. This is basically the left-hand side of the screen. I've just made it a little bit larger so people can actually see the numbers. So we're down 29% for sterling, 13.5 for dollars, 34 for Canadian dollars, 21 for euros, 12 for Swiss francs, 51% for South African rands, and almost 40% for Australian dollars. So the numbers are significant. And as I said earlier, I don't see any reason why this trend is going to not continue. The currency, even in Corona, continues to be strong. Despite the kind of political issues that we have right now, the economy is good. It is resilient. We have, huge tech capabilities, huge capabilities in other sectors, and the shekel story, I believe, is still one that's going to see continued growth. Obviously, we've seen those exchange rates. A flatline exchange rate, 10 years shekel versus which currency? It's obviously flat because it's shekel against shekel. So the rate from the shekel against shekel is always one. So if you've started off investing in a shekel portfolio and now you need some shekel income to pay your month-to-month expenses, or you're buying a property or whatever it may be, here really, this graph tells its story when you compare it to the previous one. So really having that kind of certainty and safety in the value of your actual assets is often as important or more important than some tax that's potentially paid. So the shekel investment opportunities, what are they? If you hold money in shekels in cash, really you're getting zero. I see clients even with big money and they're getting paid 0.0 something. So really, by the time you take into account a shekel inflation rate, there isn't really any story to be invested in shekels and holding your cash at the bank. Property, very expensive in Israel. The rental yields and residential property, if you get 3% gross, you're probably doing quite well. You've probably got an 8 to 9% entry cost, so you're probably writing off 3 years worth of rental income just to buy the property by the time you take into account the purchase tax and the lawyer's fees and the agent's fees, etc. What I will say about property in Israel is I also appreciate it's not just an investment decision. Lots of people buy property in Israel as an emotional decision. I can completely understand that. If I'm looking at it though as purely as an investment play, it's not something I would recommend. If it's something that you're doing, as I said, because you may come to live here or you may have family members here, etc., and you're doing it for an emotional or a familial reason, then that's something else. But as a pure investment play, I don't believe the opportunity is particularly attractive. Bonds, I mentioned before, this is basically the first time since 2011 where the opportunity in Israeli bonds exists, and it's a story that's worth telling and publicizing to clients, because we will look at tax rates soon. But basically the tax rate in Israel is 15% on interest. So if you're earning 3% and you're paying away 15%, you're still earning 2.55%, as opposed to your US dollar bond where you're paying 1.25%, and where you're earning 1.25%. And if you're in the US as a US taxpayer, you'll also be paying some tax on that too. So really, the tax story doesn't necessarily make sense when you look at kind of the investment story, because you're still going to be better off in shekel bonds than you are in US bonds, and you'll have that certainty of the currency that we've discussed. In terms of Israeli equities, the Tel Aviv 35 index, which is the main stock index in Israel, like some other stock indexes around the world, it's not particularly well weighted. Unfortunately, the 5 biggest companies equate to 35% of the index. So really, your main exposure is to those currencies. The main reason the Tel Aviv 35 hasn't really performed that well over the last years is Teva. Teva, which is obviously one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, its share price has absolutely plummeted in the last 2 or 3 years. And because it used to be the biggest single component in the index, and because it's such a big weighting, at the moment it's only around 7%, but historically it was up even at 15%. It really has kind of a drag on the other, on the whole index, basically. So even though in general, as a company, we don't believe in single equity selection, we don't believe we can outperform, we'd rather buy the index and take our diversified exposure that way. With our Israeli portfolios, we do basically buy some of the Israeli shares that we like, simply because the index is not a very good way of getting exposure to those companies. The international equities, as I said before, you've got a huge range for non-US citizens of shekel options. You could have a whole portfolio of international equities denominated in shekels for non-US citizens. That would basically give you the growth that you would get in the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq without owning a single Israeli share. So that's definitely something for those of you who are non-US clients that I would seriously consider, because you can get the same exposure but have that certainty of exchange rate. Okay, tax consequences of investing in shekels. This slide's focused on non-US citizens. The next slide will focus on US citizens. Although the first 3 things apply basically across the board to everybody. Your investment income in Israel, there's no marginal rate. So you're taxed at flat rates, whether you earn 1 million shekels as an employee or you earn 0. Any income you make from investments is taxed at the same rate. On bond interest or cash interest, that's 15%. On dividends or capital gains, that's 25%. If you're a major shareholder in a company, the tax rates are a little bit different, but for the purposes of this webinar, we're not going to go into that. We're just going to assume you're just it's a standard company issuing a standard bond, you're a standard client purchasing a standard bond or standard equity. If you're an Israeli resident or an Oleh from a non-US country who's been here 10 years, there's 0 difference to your tax position. So whether you have your money in dollars or pounds or in shekels, you're going to basically pay the same. So there's an argument to be made, well, just remove that exchange rate risk. If you're an Oleh within your first 10 years, you will pay the Israeli tax, but you will eliminate the exchange rate risk. So it does allow for certainty. I always tell people, I wouldn't urge you to go 100% into Israeli shekel as a portfolio if you're still within your 10 years. But certainly I would have some allocation, and certainly as you get towards the end of the 10 years, years 7, 8, 9, it's time to start building up that shekel portfolio, especially in an environment where the shekel continues to strengthen. If you're a foreign resident and you want to have some money invested in shekels, so you live in England or South Africa or Canada or anything like that, you will pay the Israeli tax rates on your Israeli income. You'll obviously have to report them to your local tax authorities, but double tax treaties do exist between Israel and all the major all the major countries in the world. So you will not pay double tax. You may pay some additional tax or whatever, depending on exchange rates or depending on the various tax treaties. But in general, you're going to receive a tax credit for the tax you've already paid in Israel on your Canadian, South African, UK, wherever it may be, taxes. And as I said earlier, you do have that opportunity to invest in global indices and global opportunities denominated in shekels. In terms of tax consequences of investing in shekels for the US, it's the same flat rates. If you've basically already if you've been here 10 years or you've always been Israeli resident because you just happen to have a US passport from a parent or whatever, you're not going to have any difference to your tax position. So it actually, you're going to pay tax. Just now it will change as to who you pay tax to first. So if you have Israeli-based assets, the Israeli government will receive the first share as opposed to the US government. But again, this is an opportunity for you to remove the exchange rate risk, and you will get credit on your US taxes for the Israeli taxes paid. In general, for US clients, and I say it's in general, the Israeli tax rate is usually slightly higher than the US tax rate. So often there actually isn't any additional tax to pay in the US, but that can change depending on your circumstances. But you're always happy to kind of consult with your US CPA just to make sure that you are invested as tax efficiently as possible. As I said, the Oleh within their first 10 years, you'll pay Israeli tax at a marginally higher rate than your US tax, but you will obviously, by earning shekel income, eliminate the exchange rate risk, and you will always get a tax credit on your US taxes for the Israeli tax paid. And the same really for a US resident. You'll pay the Israeli tax locally, but you'll get a credit on your US tax return when you file in the US. And at least for now, we are seeing again some trends to move away from this, but because of that PFIC issue that I explained before, it's basically, it doesn't really make sense from a tax perspective to be investing in the global indices denominated in shekels as it stands right now. Very quick, for those of you who haven't got experience with Israeli banks, again, some of you may have seen this slide before. There's no real uniformity. You know, if you go into HSBC in London or in Manchester, or you go into Chase in New York, Florida, or California, there's a pretty standard set of forms and a pretty standard experience that you'll have when opening a bank account. In Israel, that doesn't exist. Every branch of every bank is different. It's crazy, but that's still the way it is. So you just have to get used to it. It's definitely much easier to open an account when you already live in Israel and you have a Taudat Zahut, which I assume is the vast majority of people on this call. For those of you who do want an English level of customer service and have the assets to be in maybe the private banking sectors or centers or the international private banking centers, you will be able to get an English speaking service. It's not private banking how we're maybe used to it from dealing with, you know, Swiss private bankers or American or other country, you know, private bankers with that level of customer service we described before. My final slide before I put my contact details on, and I think this is actually one of the most important, is people are very unaware, even long-term Olim, that basically there's a huge number of Israeli savings and retirement plans that offer kind of tax-deferred or tax-free income similar to ISAs in the UK, some pension things that are similar to IRAs in the US, and they are thoroughly underutilized. And I've spelt it because with a Z because I think most people he'll be American, even though it kills me to see it without the S. But they are thoroughly underutilized by Olim. Just as an example of that, and again, they're a bit messy for US citizens. There's a scheme called a Kupat Gemel LaHashka'a, where you can put away 70,000 shekels each year in a very tax advantageous scheme. And again, and each individual can do it. So if you're married, you can put 70,000 shekel in, your wife can put 70,000 shekel in. It's an annual allowance. So we're now in the middle of November. You could put 140,000 shekel in between you now, and then another 140,000 shekel on January the 1st or January the 2nd. And in a very swift time, we've got 280,000 shekels wrapped in a very tax-friendly and efficient manner for Olim or for people who've been, you know, whether you've been here for the 10 years or not for the 10 years, it's certainly something that you can kind of build a nest egg very quickly. I mean, that's about $83,000 in the matter of 6 weeks, and then continue for the rest of your life, being able to, you know, contribute as the law stands right now, 70,000 shekels. So that's something to consider. There's all sorts of other Israeli pension schemes that people obviously will get through work, etc. I will again flag the US issue here. These schemes in general are not particularly friendly for US citizens. There are, my understanding is, for Keren Hishtonda and for the pension schemes, the Kupat Gemel and the Karanot Pensia, that there are a couple of options in the market now that are not PFICs and can be utilized by Americans, but I certainly say it's worth having a conversation, because your general Israeli investment advisor and big Israeli investment institution, particularly for US clients, will have no idea about PFIC and will have no idea about investing in Israel for a US citizen. I get probably 2 or 3 referrals a month from US CPAs in Israel for basically clients with Shekel portfolios where the institution isn't aware of their American status, or is aware but doesn't know how to invest for them. And we have to basically unpick through all these PFICs, which are very, very punitive from a tax perspective and messy for your tax accountant to file. So it's certainly helpful to have basically, as I said, right at the initial page of this webinar, you need to have basically somebody who can tailor the solution to your taxation needs. And that's something that we at Pioneer have huge experience of doing. I'm going to leave this slide up whilst I look to the question and answers, and I'm conscious we've probably got maybe 15 minutes or so where we can answer them. Please do reach out to me. That's my Israeli mobile number available on WhatsApp, or give me a call, etc. My email address, aaron@piowealth.com. More information about Pioneer can be found at our website, www.piowealth.com. I'm really grateful to you all for taking time out on a Tuesday evening to listen to me. I will open up the question and answer. Please fire away. And as I say, if you've got a particular personal individual issue, please do reach out. So, okay, I can see Nathan has asked, using an Israeli brokerage account and initial investment account is in shekels, to invest in international equities will require you to pay to exchange shekels to dollars, pounds, etc. No, depends how you do it. If you want to invest in direct US or UK equities, then you can do so. But if you're looking to do what I indicated before, which is invest in international indices or international funds in shekels, then there'll be no exchange rate to pay. The average total expense ratio for international funds, Ruth has asked. The expense ratio for the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF is 0.03. What's the expense ratio for the equivalent funds denominated in shekels? It is a little bit more expensive, usually around 0.3% per year. I would say if you hedge the currency, it's even a little bit more expensive than that. The cost of the hedge is also usually around 0.3 or 0.4% per year. So it's not as cheap as the off-the-shelf American products, that's for sure. But if you think about the kind of protection against currency swings that a 0.4% hedging costs provides, then I think it's worth it. As I said, also you can invest in these indices and then without hedging the currency, so you don't pay that extra 0.4, but you are subject to the movement and the fluctuation in currencies. RIA Shekel account, are the dividends also taxed by the US? The income, they could put you, does the income from dividends affect my overall US income? Absolutely. It's dividend income like any dividend income. So whether you've got the dividend from Apple in the US or from Teva in Israel, you will have to obviously report that on your tax return. So it could push you into a higher bracket depending on where you sit. You will, however, get credit on your US taxes for the Israeli tax you will have paid on the withheld dividend tax. Fine. Leah asks, what happens to money in 401k when that is withdrawn? How is that taxed? In your first 10 years, and again, I'm not a tax advisor, so and where I'm overreaching, I will make sure I mention that. When you withdraw your 401k for the first 10 years, you won't pay anything in Israel. Afterwards, you will pay, but it will obviously depend on your US tax rate too. So that's certainly something that I would speak to a US CPA about, and I'm happy to make an introduction if you email me, and with the greatest of pleasure, we can put you in the right direction. The 70,000 shekel per year is a kupat gemel hashka'ah. I have some more information on it as well. So if you'd like, please do reach out, and we can assist. And it's 70,000 shekels per year. So as I say, in a very swift space of time, you can have 140,000 shekel there. A property investment opportunity which is meant to bring back 9% as opposed to standard 3%. Would you say that is worthwhile? Again, without knowing anything about it, I think if you can make 9% in this environment, you're doing very well. And usually, though, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. I'd have to have a look at the opportunity before I could comment as to its as to its eligibility. What is considered large? I don't know what you're referring to, I'm afraid. So please re-ask, and I can assist.
Our net portfolio size.
In terms of in terms of what? In terms of opening at Switzerland? Is that what the question? If that was what the question referred to, you're probably looking at $1 million or more to have kind of a Shekel portfolio in Switzerland. So around about 3.5 million Shekels. IRA ISA schemes also accommodate stocks and bond options. What are the returns range? Again, it's the same. I'm not fully sure I understand the question. But again, bonds in Israel, investment grade, so not the high yield, riskier things, are returning around 3%, and equities, whether they're in the US or in Israel, are usually around 7, maybe 8% a year. That's kind of what you're looking at. What sort of things should a young couple be thinking about before investing? Again, probably not within the scope of this webinar, but you want to be utilizing as much tax-free opportunities. So that 70,000 shekel thing that I mentioned about before. The younger you are, probably the riskier the portfolio you should have, just because you've got the opportunity to ride the volatility in the long term, because your time horizon is longer than people who are a little bit older. But again, you have to obviously be able to put that money away to the side and not think about it if you're going to need it to buy property in the future or something like that. Then it's a different type of conversation. But again, please reach out and I'll be happy to try and give you some guidance. What's the interest rate on the Israeli savings retirement plans that you mentioned? It's not an interest rate. It's an investment portfolio. So there's no fixed interest rate or anything like that. So whatever the bonds are paying at that time will be the interest rate, and whatever the return you get from the equity portion of the portfolio will be the return. What's the minimum required to invest with us? Good question. In general, we take portfolios in shekels from 1 million shekels and up. If you've got 750,000 or 800,000, we're definitely happy to have a conversation with you. We do manage funds in the US from lower levels, from around $200,000, which is more like kind of 650, something like that, 700,000 shekels. So we do manage money all over the world. So we've got clients with money in Luxembourg, in Switzerland, in the UK, in the US, in Israel. So we can help you. But in terms of shekel portfolios, probably kind of 750 or 800,000 shekel is where we start from. Regarding the robo-advisor question, what do you know about Vidya from Lumi? Is it a good service? I don't know anything about it, I'm afraid, so I don't know. What I do know, I get asked a lot about Schwab have a robo-advising option in the States for clients, and basically you're not allowed to be non-US resident and be a part of it. So I've had some clients who've come to me because Schwab have thrown them out. So it's just something to mention, that you can't utilize your US dollars in robo trading funds because they're not marketed or sold to non-US citizens. Can you explain a bit more the process of setting up a hedge of currency exchange for some larger amounts of dollars? If you're doing big money transfers, our recommendation is always do them slowly, average in. If the rate moves in your favor, do it a little bit quicker. If the rate moves against you, do it a little bit slower. But that's really kind of the only advice that we can give. We're never going to be able to guess and say, oh, tomorrow it's going up or tomorrow it's going down. What we can do is see trends. But in general, kind of, as I say, dip your toe in and don't try not to leave it to a position where you're forced to do, you're forced to act. So you're buying a property and you've basically got no choice but to take a huge, whack of dollars and transfer them into shekels at whatever rate happens to be on that day. Certainly try and prepare as much as you can. My wife and I are US Israeli citizens who made Aliyah 3 years ago. The bulk of our retirement plans are either a 401k plan or TSP savings plans. Is there a way to move those funds to Israel without paying taxes on those funds? Not really, I'm afraid. I mean, obviously, when you start to take withdrawals, you can move the money that you've withdrawn to Israel and invest in shekels. You can't really take pension money that's in a 401k and bring it over to Israel and invest a significant percentage of it in shekels, unfortunately, without taking a big tax hit in the US. So if you've got big IRA accounts or 401k plans or whatever it may be in the States, just as if you have a big SIP or or a SAS in the UK, unfortunately, your ability to invest those in shekels is basically non-existent. What sort of investment would you recommend for a small amount, like 100,000 shekels, and how to go about it? I'd probably either use one of the online brokerage houses that you can get in Israel, or go to your Israeli bank. Some of them for 100,000 shekels may even give you an investment advisor, and that's probably how I would start and get yourself familiar with the system. If you have to pay capital gains tax of 25% every year on international funds denominated in shekel, is it not better to buy the equivalent Vanguard or iShares ETF funds if, as an Olair, I would be tax exempt for 10 years? But again, it depends on the currency movement, and depends. You remember, you're only going to pay capital gains tax once you've sold it, so you don't pay it on an arising basis. It's only on a so if you've made 10%, then you don't have to pay 2.5% each year. You only have to pay 2.5% of that, of the 10% when you actually come to realize those gains. So again, it's a big factor is really the currency element. So yes, that's why I'm saying for most people the 10-year tax kind of exemption plays with their mind. Why should I invest in shekels when I'm going to have to pay tax, which otherwise I wouldn't have to pay tax? But if you speak to a Canadian or an English Olair from 10 years ago and offered them the chance to pay some Israeli tax but keep their money worth what it was worth before, then I'm sure they would do that. So again, it's a currency risk or exchange rate risk versus a tax risk, and it's really whatever you feel comfortable with. But as I said, the 10-year tax rule, as fantastic as it sounds and as brilliant as it's been to encourage aliyah, as we saw from the graph earlier, it really kind of has decimated value for people because of the fact the shekel has just continued to strengthen and strengthen. Is it worthwhile to buy property as an investment? Or I can see the follow-up question, is it worthwhile to buy property for yourself to live in? As I said before, on a pure investment focus, I don't believe Israeli property is a particularly attractive investment proposition. As I said, I appreciate buying a property in Israel has emotional connections and ties, and people also, especially if you're going to live in it, want to own their own property. If they want to put a hole in the wall over there, they can do so without having to ask anybody. So if you're talking to me about it as a pure investment play, I don't think property purchase in Israel is smart right now. And as I said, though, it's not the only factor, so that's something to consider. Could you tell us your thoughts about whether Israeli bonds will continue to improve? Any bonds in particular that are especially strong? Always with bonds, it's you need a diversified approach. Don't put in all your eggs in one basket. At Pioneer, we basically have a kind of a 4% maximum exposure to any one currency and any one company, and a 3% maximum exposure to any one issue. Because however good or however strong a company is, we want to make sure we avoid the landmines if God forbid they do go off. So certainly keep a diversified portfolio, and obviously you'll have some bonds in there that will yield you 2%. You'll have some yields that bond you 4%, etc. And you want to have a nice mix, and also when they mature, etc. The duration. So that's part of kind of our expertise to ensure we build you a portfolio that is that fits your purposes and helps you with what you need. Yes, Pioneer Wealth Management, we do charge a fee percentage, so we'll take a percentage of the assets under management that we manage. We don't really do kind of hourly based consulting, etc. So that's how we do. Which pension schemes are not PFIC? If you're American, they nearly all are. There's a couple that aren't. Reach out to me privately and I can make an introduction, but in general, basically all of them are. What are the fees for your services? Again, it depends on the amount. In true Israeli style, everything is negotiable. Obviously, it depends on the amount of assets that you manage with us. So somebody with 1 million shekels will pay more than somebody with 5 or 10. Are there Israeli money market funds that try to keep a flat per share price? The Israeli money market funds right now are basically paying 0.1, if that. So really, as an investment kind of concept, it's not really something I'm recommending to clients. Either invest the money or keep the money in cash at the bank. The money market fund just isn't really paying you anything. Can you tell me the ticker symbol name of the best international funds denominated in shekel? Not at this stage, I'm afraid. It's not really part of the scope of this, but you can have a look. As I said, the growth in this area is exponential, and people are literally adding funds every day. So that's definitely something that you can look at, and we can help point you in the right direction. For Israeli bonds, I'm only seeing ROIs that are under 1% unless they're 30-year bonds. Could you explain, if possible, what I'm missing regarding this? Thanks. You're probably looking at Israeli government bonds denominated in dollars, and that's probably what you're looking at. So I don't think you're looking at the correct information there. What are the names of the smaller investment houses for people with less money to invest? I would probably start, if you're under 250,000 shekel, my recommendation would probably be start with your bank. Otherwise, reach out to me, and I would be happy to try and maybe put you in the right direction. But certainly for those of you who aren't US, the Kupat Gemal Hashgar, the 70,000 shekel, definitely please be in touch, because we can help you with that and point you in the right direction to the right insurance company to help you out with that. Okay, perfect timing with about 3 minutes left. We've come to the end. Thank you again all for your time. Thank you, Mike, for helping with the question and answer, and thank you, Josh and Nefesh B'Nefesh, for hosting us. As I say, my details are on the page. Please do reach out if we can be of any assistance whatsoever. And have a wonderful evening. And please be in touch. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Mike, for doing yeoman's effort on the back end here. And thank you all for joining us. This was recorded, and we will be sending it out in the next 24 to 48 hours. Just have to do a little bit of light editing on the front and end. And we look forward to continue assisting you. We'll be sending out both the recording of the session and the PowerPoint presentation that Aaron presented, along with all the contact information. Thank you, and have a great night.